engineer, hybrid and electronic systems from Ricardo, and Yorgo Chatzimarkakis, who's a Secretary General for Hydrogen Europe. Okay, you're both here. Right. Yeah. Just move here, then it's easier to talk. Excellent. So, well, the goal is to discuss also, well, not natural gas and electric, as we've just had some presentations, but there are other things we can discuss. But before we have, it would be good to get from you, Yorgo, and Phil, or Ricardo, your views on the current alternative technologies, what is available, and so Yorgo, maybe because you are involved with Hydrogen Europe, could you please bring to us like your views on why hydrogen as an alternative for heavy-duty trucks?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. It was quite interesting to listen to both of you and to see the presentations. Basically, to explain a little bit why hydrogen and why battery sometimes is a little bit overestimated when it comes to electrifying everything. First of all, hydrogen is three things. It's an energy carrier, so you can store energy in seasonal range, so voluminous and over seasons. Second, it's a fuel. You can use it as a fuel in a fuel cell, so you can use it directly for the electrification for long haul and for heavy duty, for the hard to electrify category. And third, it's a chemical feedstock. I'm not diving into this now because this is the excuse me, the most sexy thing at the moment in Brussels, because the decarbonization of industry, steel industry, refining industry, chemical industry, is possible via greening of hydrogen. So I leave that out. And I stay with the energy carrier and the fuel. In a situation where you have a lot of curtailment, and you have it in the north of Europe at a high extent because the power grid is just too small, you cannot use the electrons that could be provided by this renewable energy because the power grid is restricted, it's limited. This is where hydrogen becomes interesting, because at the same time you need to curtail, you would then produce and switch in milliseconds to the production of hydrogen from electrolyzers, so from renewable energy. And then you have this fuel, zero emission, that then could be used. And that's the critique. The critique is, on one hand, why would you use electrons in any case if they are not to be harvested? You cannot harvest them. And that is where hydrogen becomes an interesting factor in the so-called sectoral integration. What is sectoral integration? Is integrating the different sectors of power grid, gas grid, which is by far much bigger, much more interconnected, and hydrogen is a gas. And if you dedicate pipelines for hydrogen, you can cheaply, it's 100 to 200 times cheaper to transport the same energy via the gas pipeline. Okay, I see some people saying, yeah, but it's only 70% of efficiency. So what? If you have no efficiency by 100% curtailment, it's better to have 70% of renewable energy that you cheaply can transport via the gas grid. This is what makes the hydrogen story quite interesting. Just to let you know that we have trucks running in Europe, especially in Switzerland. We have for years now with Coop a truck that abates a lot of CO2 and it's just running, it's just working. When I wanted to present the truck at an IRU conference in Geneva 2 months ago, it was not possible because I could not replace the truck by another truck because it's on an everyday business. So it works, it's a proven technology, and we therefore would say, why carry around, I saw your numbers, your figures, How many tons of battery you need to carry around in order to make 500 kilometers? This is something we should really talk about, because the same battery needs to be recycled one day, and there is a lot of material flow that we need to discuss. You don't have that with hydrogen and fuel cell solution. It's a much simpler process of recycling. It's 99% of recyclability of a fuel cell, if ever you need it. And this is the argument. A second argument, and then I stop, is the CNG. I liked your presentation, because your presentation is the same company, but your presentation is about CNG. Why is it so interesting? Because CNG can be produced on a renewable basis on hydrogen. So renewably produced hydrogen could be linked with waste-based CO2, you mentioned it in your presentation, and then you have a synthetic methane, a synthetic green gas that can be transported via the gas grid, that can be fueled into the technology, which is not a niche technology, that you have it already. And this is the other part of the hydrogen story that makes it extremely attractive for long haul and heavy duty. And this is ready to use. Audi, by the way, is doing that already. Audi produces in the north of Germany, in Werte, with a 6 megawatt wind park hydrogen, and adds to that CO2 from a slaughterhouse waste. And if you have a G-Tron, if you are on the G-Tron program, so the Audi G-Tron program, whatever you fuel wherever in Europe, it will be injected on the basis of green gas into the grid. So it's like in the electricity market, where you add renewable electricity into the grid, the same that you consume. It is possible already on the basis of hydrogen now, and you could do it, of course, with the truck industry all over Europe. And it's possible, it's mature technology, and it's not that expensive.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Phil, could you just bring a bit your point of view? You've been working on like developing an electrification expertise across different segments, from motorcycles, cars, and now to trucks as well. Could you bring us your views on electrification for heavy-duty trucks?
Sure. Firstly, I think there's room in the market for many, many different solutions. So the majority of the work that I've been doing has been working in vehicle electrification. But we've already heard about hydrogen, we've already heard about alternative fuels. So there's room in the market for many solutions. And then if you just look at electrification, there's room in the market for many different electric solutions, ranging from 48-volt systems right up to Porsche and others are now working on 800-volt systems and the benefits that higher voltages bring. The other point I'd like to make is that electrification of heavy-duty vehicles is probably lagging behind electrification of passenger vehicles by maybe 15 years, 20 years maybe. The first Prius came out in '96. And there's probably a good reason for that lag. And that reason is big vehicles need big batteries equals big cost. And it's only until relatively recently that the cost of the battery technology has plummeted to a point where the heavy-duty industry is now thinking, actually, we can make the total cost of ownership sums work now. A heavy-duty vehicle is never going to be cost parity when the vehicle's bought with a combustion engine vehicle because of the batteries. But a heavy-duty vehicle on the total cost of ownership will be probably more than cost parity than a conventional combustion engine vehicle.
Good. And Marco, because you are on electrification as well, how do you see the battery problem for heavy duty trucks? And like, what is your main answer to every time someone challenges but the battery is going to be too big and the truck's going to be heavy, and so on. How do you see that?
As reported in my presentation, the situation with the technology available today don't offer a good opportunity to install a large amount of the battery, especially on the 4x2 trucks, because we have a limited space available. Of course, if we want to extend the range, we need also to install the battery in the semi-trailer, but it's another world because we are a truck manufacturer. We don't produce a semi-trailer, for example. But if we consider the trend and in the 2030, the expectation in terms of improvement of the efficiency of the vehicle, reducing the cost, improving the energy density, gravimetric and volumetric. In this case, we have approximately the possibility to reduce the amount of the battery from 7 ton to 3 ton. Is a good reduction that allow to think on the full electric truck. Of course, consider the full electric truck for long haul mission is hard and too complicated because there is also a need to have a huge investment on the recharging infrastructure. For regional and urban distribution could be feasible technology. But between the diesel and the full electric vehicle, in my opinion, also the hybrid plug-in play an important role in the fuel efficiency and CO2 reduction.
Okay, great. And to some extent, Martin, when we talk about natural gas trucks, we also talk about the size of the natural gas tank that can take some of the space out of the diesel truck. How do you see that, and to what extent this is a problem?
The key thing to bear in mind is that the energy density of natural gas, if you're looking at liquid natural gas, it's something around about 60% of the energy density of diesel. So on liquid natural gas, it tends not to be a major issue. That on our 4x2 Arctics, we're getting 1,600 kilometers of range, which is more than enough. That's more than any driver can drive in a day. It's more than 2 drivers can drive in a day. When you look at the smaller vehicles, they don't have the same range requirements. Typically, operators run around with far more fuel on the vehicle than they actually need, and people are carrying a lot of dead weight. If you actually calculated the amount of fuel which is carried around by every truck in Europe on a daily basis that they don't use in that day, it's phenomenal. The CO2 benefit to Europe by actually just carrying the right amount of fuel for a day's work would be quite significant. But nobody does it. Everybody likes to have a lot of fuel with them. We sell vehicles to customers in the south of Spain who will drive from Spain up to the north of Germany, carrying something in the region of about 1,500 litres of diesel. Now, you can't use 1,500 litres in a day. Why do they do it? Because diesel fuel cost in Spain is significantly cheaper than it is in France or in Germany. So they're doing it for an economic reason. But from a CO2 point of view, it's a nonsense.
Sorry.
When we look at CNG, typically CNG is less of an issue. It tends to be more for vehicles doing smaller distances. And for CNG, the challenge is more the cost benefit between steel tanks, which are relatively economic and relatively heavy, and composite tanks, which are very light but relatively expensive. So operators need to be able to decide, are they willing to pay additional money for a lighter vehicle? And every time I ask a customer how much you're prepared to pay for a kilo, they struggle to give me an answer.
How's the tanking most in the current CNG trucks from
all our tanks are steel.
They're all steel.
Yeah.
Okay.
But composite tanks are available and readily there on the market, but they're probably 5 or 6 times the price of the steel tanks.
Okay, great. Don't you?
Well, the cost of the infrastructure and the question of the infrastructure, I think it's quite important to talk about, because up to now, looking to your presentation, there is a certain infrastructure on CNG already, especially in Italy. I mean, there's a strong Italy, Germany. There's a strong infrastructure already. When it comes to electricity, there we have a problem. I'm not sure whether you have seen what happened in Norway, country number 1 when it comes to electrification all over Europe. 30% of passenger car penetration, market penetration, very well, but that's the limit. So the battery vehicle association asked for slowing down the process of selling them, or at least not using them on Thursdays, because there's a peak. So you see, there is a natural limit. And the point here is, and I'm very clear on that, we are not against batteries. We are in favor of batteries, but in the right environment. So the urban environment is the right environment. That's super. Nothing against it. But if you have a limit already in Norway with 30%, why then use also batteries in trucks and not using existing infrastructures or building up an infrastructure that allows even more integration of renewables? That's the simple thing. Now, just to give you some ideas, a fuel cell truck, 400 kilometers of range, 8 minutes of refueling time. So what you just mentioned is exactly what we need. So it's not filling it up with 1,500 liters, but it's filling it up with fairly amount to go 400 kilometers. Then you have 8 minutes. That's it. You don't have to book your slot. And we have seen the plans of the member states of the European Union in the alternative fuels infrastructure directive. Half of them have come up with hydrogen production, and some of them plan to build hydrogen refueling stations every 50 kilometers on the trans-European networks, the TEN-T axis, the big axis. That's some of them every 50 kilometers, some of them up to 100 kilometers, which is a very good basis, I would say, for the truck business. So this is all on the way. This is all supported also by some member states, I have to say, not all of them, but some member states, more than half, and by the European Commission. We are quite happy that the European Commission has taken a technology neutral approach, wants to see how the market takes up. And this is important, I think, because in the end, it's also a question of costs and the market. Just one last figure on the costs of hydrogen now. At the moment, the electrolyzer costs are very high. So if you produce renewable hydrogen, it's quite high. If you produce blue hydrogen, that's on the basis of natural gas with the CCS technology, so you cut the hydrogen into hydrogen and CO2 by water steam, but you store the CO2, carbon capture sequestration. This is much cheaper. But let's stay with renewable hydrogen. If you go to very, very solar regions in the world, like the Arab Peninsula, you can already produce electricity for 2 cents per kilowatt hour. That gives us a range of 1.8 euro per kilo of hydrogen. So less than 2 euro per kilo of hydrogen, already with a very high electrolyzer cost now. So there you see that the price will definitely go down and still quite good. So this is the range where we are.
Okay, great. Are there any questions or comments? Anyone would like to make? Okay, there's one here. Can we have microphone, please? Yeah. So just please state your name and company.
So Ignacio García Lorenzana from Opel. Thinking about the first presentation about CNG and LNG, but also about electrification and about hydrogen. You said in your last slide that there were 2 constraints. One of them was convincing for the build of infrastructure, because you need a critical mass of vehicles in the market for someone to invest on infrastructure. But then the next point was the other challenge was convincing people to buy a vehicle with this lack of infrastructure. So it's like a vicious circle where you need some impulse to find a way out of that. which would be this kind of impulse, in your opinion, for getting, I mean, either on electric, hydrogen, or CNG, LNG to get into this infrastructure that would get people to buy the vehicles, or people buying the vehicles that would push for that infrastructure? Thank you.
Yeah, Martin?
Yeah, sure. Infrastructure-wise, you can spend relatively low amounts. So if you're running just 2 or 3 CNG vans, you probably are only spending around about €50,000 to put some infrastructure in, with a compressor and some storage, and connect it into the gas main. Relatively cost effective. When you get onto bigger vehicles, you'll be spending more money. To do a big gas station, you're looking at several million euros. But you don't have to build a big gas station immediately. Typically, what we see is that on heavy truck, if you've got an operator who's going to run something around about 10, maybe 15 vehicles, most of the gas infrastructure providers will happily build a gas station. And it can be done on a step-by-step basis. So on LNG, the initial station would look very much like an ISO container, which is put on a pad on the ground, connected up to the electricity, a bit of guardrails around it, and the station is up to running within a day. Equally well, you can produce a proper station with vertical LNG tanks, which will take months to build, but is a much bigger station which will produce maybe enough gas to be able to run 400 or 500 vehicles through it every day. So it's very much sizing the station for the requirements. But the point to bear in mind is that it doesn't have to be extremely expensive. There are guys out there with relatively low volumes will actually put a station in. And even if the volumes from one customer aren't enough, if we can find 1 or 2 customers in the area willing to actually move on to taking gas vehicles, then we'll get infrastructure built. We're seeing it happening. If I look at a comment on gas infrastructure against electric infrastructure, there's been very little in the way of incentives to build gas infrastructure. There's been huge incentives right across Europe to build electric infrastructure. Probably most of the electric infrastructure is you take a van or a truck and try and plug it into any of them, and the space physically isn't big enough. Just a couple of weeks ago, I'd got one of our daily electric vans and parked it in an electric charging bay, which was at 90 degrees to a roadway. And the van, of course, sticks out halfway across the roadway because it's half as long again as a passenger car. Because nobody looks and thinks when they build electric vehicle infrastructure for charging that vehicles are actually slightly bigger than passenger cars.
Okay, thank you. And Phil, how do you see infrastructure as a problem to develop electrification in the heavy-duty sector? Is it the main problem, or is it just one of the issues?
I think it's been mentioned before that there is a kind of chicken and egg situation with infrastructure and the purchase of electric vehicles. That is probably going to be here for a long, long time to come. But the infrastructure is getting better. In the UK, there's at least 300 charge points going in, new charge points going in every month. So the situation is improving fairly significantly. But I think, as I said, for a long, long time, there's going to be this chicken and egg situation. What will help is when the vehicles are cost parity, because if we're talking volume vehicles, then it's passenger cars. And there will be a point sometime soon, probably 2022, 23, where the battery cost will mean the vehicles are cost parity. So that will be a pretty big incentive for somebody to seriously consider buying an electric vehicle. I suppose moving sort of in a slightly sideways direction, the electricity does cost, but is there going to be a point where the fuel revenue, because fuel's taxed at 70%-ish, domestic electricity is taxed at 5%. So is there going to be a point in the future where governments are going to say, hang on a minute, we're not getting the fuel revenue that we used to. We're going to slap an additional tax on electricity. Is that going to be in a smart way? where we have a smart meter where you pay for your electricity for your car at a different rate than you pay for your electricity for your house. So there's already mutterings going on about that in government circles in various parts of the world. So that is an interesting point. It is yet to be developed fully, shall we say.
Because Marco, how can a manufacturer play with this chicken neck situation? How can the manufacturer encourage people to invest in infrastructure and encourage customers to buy electric trucks, even if the infrastructure is still not there?
Oh, it's very complicated to promote an investment on the infrastructure, especially because currently the infrastructure is more focused on passenger car application. And of course, you consider the truck business in the electrification with to have more power to the charging station. And we are more closer to the application is already under development for urban bus application, but typically this kind of infrastructure are fully dedicated for buses. Is not at the moment under evaluation the interoperability with trucks or other vehicles. It's complicated. At the moment, we have also good experience in our development in full electric urban bus. The customer is not only oriented on one solution. You have some customer asking to have a full range capability of our bus with all the energy installed on board. Other customer are asking to have the opportunity charging mode, so to have a small battery with the possibility to recharge at the bus stop in the depot. So it's very complicated to promote. I also read recently a report published in April of this year from European Environment Agency. As in this report is reported at the moment there is an underinvestment on the high-power charging station. So we need to have a contribution of the policy to enlarge the diffusion of charging station. Also considering the possibility to use the battery in the second life to create a local energy storage in the charging station in order to reduce the cost of overall infrastructure and the connection to the power grid.
Yeah, great. Thank you. There's one question.
One question in general about electric charging stations. I would just make a quick comment quoting the Commissioner Cañete yesterday on a debate in the Council. Just thinking about a more ambitious target for passenger cars and light commercial, which is a little bit different from our story, but it relates. It says 50% reduction, if we listen to the more ambitious member states, would mean 7 million zero-emission vehicle on road against current 140,000. Those were his figures, and required 700,000 charging stations against currently 80,000. So his comment was huge investments on infrastructure are to be put in place. This comment was directed to the member states, right? So I would like to understand, because on the side of the OEM, obviously we are trying to work on placing these technologies on the market. However, and this is an attention point to the Commission, is how can we incentivize member states to put in place the infrastructure and the investment that is required in the following 7 years at least, or maybe 10 years. So I don't know, in the perspective of the panelists, if you have any comment around this.
Okay. Yeah. There's a comment, please.
Yeah, well, there's very good news looking at the budget of the European Commission that has been proposed, because due to Brexit, sorry, we are all sorry about that, but the budget has been cut. Everybody's sorry, I know, but the budget has been cut. With two exceptions. One is research innovation, And the other one is the Connecting Europe facilities. That's quite interesting, that the CEF for transport and the CEF Connecting Europe facility for the energy infrastructure has been pushed up, which is quite important because now member states have an incentive if they come up in refurbishing, retrofitting their TEN-T corridors. To take one example, to use the CEF money and to do exactly this. So the incentive given by the European Commission is there. So that's the good news. The bad news is that member states do not really are not streamlined when it comes to that. And then I have difficult messages. Huh? If I look, you're Italian, right? Italy is #1 country on gas, CNG top, gas pipeline top. But if you look at the Italian messaging, it's electricity, it's battery, it's electrons. Mr. Sarace and Nelson. So these are things I don't really understand, and they are not logical, because we're creating hypes. We had this hype with biofuels some years ago. We created a Frankenstein monster. That's what we did in Europe, all of us. I was included, because I had a role as a member of parliament, and I issued all these things deliberately, wrongly. It was wrong. And now we know. So we have to take care that we have a balanced approach, not to look at one simple solution only, because everybody can imagine that. And politicians are easy victims for that. Simple victims, because they don't count to 3. Sorry, I was myself politician. They count to 2. If you count to 2, recharging is simple to understand. The sector integration thing is much more difficult, complex, but this is where we need to go. So I'm saying this, seeing that my technology lives a hype, not in transport, but in decarbonization of industry. I'm seeing a hype there, and I'm calming down people because we have to manage expectations. And this is not happening in the battery sector. In the battery sector, you have the opposite thing. You have a creation of expectation which is not matching the reality. That's the problem. So let's all calm down. I know my deficiencies. I know my problems. But I hate that the reality is not discussed. And this is why I'm very grateful for being invited. And now is the time to go to the member states and to ask them for a balanced approach. So in the case of Italy, this would mean to have a very good approach to using the gas infrastructure in creating CNG, but also hydrogen plus electricity, battery electricity in towns. That would be great. This is not happening, because we are going for black and white and for extremes, and this is not matching, or this is not mirroring the reality.
Okay, so one final question here in front.
Yeah. Thank you. Question and some comments about the taxes. That's true for all alternative fuels. So I don't think it's discriminant. The point is that they are all not or low taxed, and the moment that happens, it's the same for all. So I wouldn't say that I would tag that to electricity or whatever. Not only, but the moment you start having 10% replacement of oil vehicles for whatever alternative fuels, cost will go crashing down, because we saw a mismatch of 3% between demand and offer what created a few years ago. So guess when you take out the demand from the market of that size, what happens to oil costs? So thinking about oil prices going up to justify things, we should be balanced. About the question, I saw very optimistic things about particles emission, but what I see, I come from Zurich particle conference, is that it might be that in reality we are not measuring the particles because they are become smaller than 23 nanometers. So do you have measures about that? I mean, because that's a bit of the risk, and that's been proven on some engines in tests which have been published last week. So were you looking at 23 nanometers, I guess?
I'll just make a comment on that. That at the moment, gas engines don't have any form of particulate trap on them.
Yeah,
so if I have a challenge on particulates, I can do as I've done on diesel engines, and it's going to happen on petrol engines. I can start to look at particulate trap technology to actually address any issues that can come up on particulates.
I know, but the point is that what
there's room
is
to
on the
move.
market now doesn't. And therefore, in terms of particles, if that's the case, we might have more than we expect. And about the infrastructure and chicken and egg and so on, I'm surprised there's 700,000 chargers. I mean, electric vehicles, and I am an owner, makes sense if you can charge either at home and the office. And that's the main thing you need. The other chargers are there in case. Or if in cities where the possibility for charging at home is limited. So I think that in some cases we don't need to break any chicken and egg, because in countries where 30-40% of the people have access to a garage or parking place, then there the issue is just a normal Schuko plug.
The problem, though, is that we want the electric vehicles mainly in the city, and the city is the area where fewest people will have the opportunity for off-road parking and therefore off-road charging. So we have that dilemma.
Well, I think
I have
the first
flats.
thing we will address, I'm thinking about Brussels, is people coming from outside, and they do the number of kilometers that
Okay.
justify
In that case, it's okay.
they are the ones polluting, and they have the small house in the village that has the garage. So, and there, if you take this type of cars, as I say, in Brussels, we would solve overnight the air quality problem.
The flat where I live during the week has what's called permit parking. There are 200 parking spaces. I can park in any one of those parking spaces. So every day I park in a different space. So I can't run a cable from my flat to the
No.
car. It will only work if we had dedicated parking.
But in this kind of parking, we would need really a low-cost infrastructure, not the...
Yeah, could be.
And that's probably the next
That's
thing.
probably where it will end up.
Is not the big chargers, but very simple. I mean, like the block heaters that they have in northern countries.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, we've run a bit over time, but any final questions from, any final thoughts from any of you? Anything you had in mind, like, no, I need to say this in the panel and we haven't discussed. Any final? Phil?
No, nothing more from me.
Can I just make one comment? It's
Yes,
really nice
please.
to hear a politician who talks some common sense.
Good. Yogo?
Time for reality has come, but no, I think in the very long run, 2050, a petrol car, what's nowadays a petrol car, will be more or less a battery car, and a diesel car or van will be more or less fuel cell, because both are zero emission, both are electric. One is long range, the other one is shorter range. And with the example that we just heard from Russell, this is perfectly in the image of petrol to diesel. So this is what I predict.
Great, thank you. And Marco, any final thoughts?
No, I don't have additional point to highlight. Thank you.
Good. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for the discussion. I think to conclude the discussion and the day, it's been a great discussion on heavy duty fuel economy CO2, because that's the new regulation, and it is a game changing regulation. So there's a lot to be discussed within the next few years, and the industry and the supply chain and all different parts involved will have a lot to adjust for the first 15% reduction target. And I think the main interesting point is now we came to the moment where alternative technologies are needed. It's no longer a nice to have, well, there are things happening. Now we understand it is going to be needed. The question is to what extent these alternative technologies can play a role into reducing overall CO2 emissions and fuel consumption. So yeah, thank you very much for this and all.